Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We hope you had a pleasant flight. We are now approaching San Francisco International Airport and will be landing in about 30 minutes around 11:30 a.m. local time. The current weather in San Francisco is clear with a temperature of 17 degrees C. We thank you for flying. Asiana Airlines, a member of Star Alliance, enjoy your stay in San Francisco, and we hope to see you again soon. Asiana Airlines Flight 214 is on the final approach after a long journey. From South Korea, on board 307 people are anticipating a smooth landing at one of the busiest airports in the United States. The weather is perfect and visibility is clear, but in the moments to come the crew will face unexpected challenges, will test their skills and decision-making. This is the story of Asiana Airlines Flight 214 on the morning of July 6, 2013. Asiana Airlines Flight 214. A Boeing 7 was nearing San Francisco International Airport. The Boeing Tri-7 is known as one of the safest and most reliable planes in commercial aviation, and Asiana Airlines had a strong safety record up to this point. On board, the atmosphere was calm as passengers settled in for the final moments of their journey. Some looked out the windows, enjoying the clear skies and beautiful views. As the plane began its descent, a crew of 4 pilots operated this flight. Captain Lee Cook, who was in training on the Boeing Tri-7, had 9,700 flight hours, but only 43 hours on this aircraft type. He was the pilot flying for this flight with First Officer Lee Jongman as his instructor and pilot monitoring. He had over 12,000 flight hours and was responsible for overseeing the approach and landing. A relief captain and relief first officer were also part of the crew. They took control during the cruise phase. This rotating system is standard on long-haul flights to ensure the crew is well rested before the critical approach and landing phases for the flight crew. It felt like the middle of the night according to their internal body clocks, as they were still aligned with South Korea time. This meant they were operating at a time when their bodies would typically be at rest, which likely affected their alertness and decision-making. Despite this, after approximately 10 hours of flight, the airplane was cleared for a straight-in visual approach to runway 28, left at San Francisco International Airport. The weather conditions were favorable for a visual approach. Winds were light and visibility was 10. Mega runway 28, left at San Francisco International Airport, measures 11,381 ft long and 200 ft wide. With its long stretch, it is well suited for handling large aircraft, like the Boeing trip. 7. The airport is equipped with an instrument landing system, a precision radio navigation system that provides short-range guidance to aircraft during their approach to a runway. Especially in poor weather or low visibility, the ILS works via 2 types of radio signals: the localizer and the glide slope. The localizer helps the pilots or the autopilot keep the aircraft aligned. With the runway center line, it indicates whether the plane is too far to the left or right and helps guide it back onto the correct path. The glide slope helps the pilots control the aircraft's descent angle, making sure it follows the correct slope down to the runway. It indicates whether the plane is too high or too low on the approach on this particular day. Though the glide slope for runway 28 left was out of service, adding complexity to the approach. Without automated guidance for their descent angle, the crew had to manually control the airplane's descent to stay on the correct glide path. While the glide slope was unavailable, the localizer remained operational, providing lateral guidance for the approach. The paid partner of today's video is BetterHelp, the world's largest online tour service, founded in 2013. BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. BetterHelp is a platform where therapists and their clients can communicate effectively and get the most out of therapy. With a large network of credentialed therapists, BetterHelp makes it easy to find someone who understands your unique needs and who can help you with a wide range of personal challenges. You get the same quality as in office therapy with the convenience of communicating how and when you want, by phone, video, or messaging. With a 4.5-star rating on TR Pilot, you can feel confident in the quality of care you will receive. If you ever feel that your therapist isn't the right fit, switching to another one is easy and at no extra cost. Your mental health is just as important as your physical well-being, and BetterHelp makes it accessible and affordable, ready to think. That next step toward better mental well-being. Visit betterhelp.com, aircraft investigation, or select aircraft investigation at sign-up to get a special discount on your first month of therapy. Now, let's go back to the video. Captain Lee Kang-kook, who was the pilot flying, had limited experience with the Boeing Tri-7 and had never manually landed this type of aircraft without the assistance of the ILS. This was his first time attempting a visual approach at San Francisco International Airport. Although he felt uncertain and uneasy about the situation, he remained silent about his concerns. Cultural dynamics, where deference to authority is common, likely influenced this decision in the hierarchical environment of the cockpit he might have. Hesitated to express doubt in front of the more experienced instructor pilot at 11:12. Local time. 15 minutes before landing. The relief first officer returned to the cockpit and took his seat in the jump seat behind the captain and first officer. By this point, the crew had already completed the descent checklist. As the flight continued toward its destination, the crew was cleared to descend to lower altitudes and guided to intercept a straight-in approach to runway 28, left 9 minutes later. Approach control asked the flight crew if they had the airport in sight. First Officer Lee confirmed they did, and the air traffic controller cleared them for a visual approach. The airplane was descending through 300 ft at an airspeed of about 201 knots, with the flaps and landing gear still up. The autopilot flight director system was in flight level change speed mode, which adjusts the airplane's pitch to maintain a selected airspeed during descent raising. The nose to slow down and lowering the nose to increase speed. The auto throttle was in hold mode, meaning the system was no longer adjusting engine thrust to control speed, leaving the engines at their current setting unless manually adjusted by the pilots. At 11:23, the airplane captured the localizer as it descended through 800 ft. The pilot flying Captain Lee commanded flaps 1 to be set, and the pilot monitoring confirmed speed check. Flaps 1 set about 14 miles from the runway, descending through 4,800 ft. Air traffic control instructed them to reduce their air speed to 180 knots and maintain that speed until 5 miles out. The pilot flying adjusted the airspeed accordingly and called for flaps 5 speed check. Flaps 5 set, while their actions were appropriate, leaving the autopilot in flight level change speed mode made managing the descent more challenging. The autopilot adjusted the airplane's pitch to maintain the selected airspeed, which meant that when the pilot flying reduced it, the autopilot raised the nose to slow the aircraft to manage the descent more effectively. The flight crew could have deployed the speed brakes but chose not to. This decision caused the airplane to drift above the glide path, and at this point things started to go wrong. The pilots didn't immediately notice the aircraft was no longer on the correct 3-degree glide path. In the meantime, the descent rate dropped to 300 ft per minute, far too low to stay on course with the airplane now about 11.2 nautical miles from the runway and descending through 300 ft. The pilot flying switched the autopilot pitch mode from flight level change speed to vertical speed mode setting. The descent rate to -1,000 ft per minute. In flight level change speed mode, the autopilot adjusts the descent to maintain the selected airspeed, but in vertical speed mode, the crew manually selects the rate of descent, while this gave the pilots more control over the descent rate. It also required closer attention to airspeed to avoid issues with speed management. At the same time, the auto throttle automatically switched from hold to SPD mode. In hold mode, the auto throttle doesn't adjust the thrust, but once it transitions to SPD mode, it actively manages the aircraft's airspeed by adjusting engine thrust to match the selected speed, although the airplane's vertical speed increased toward the target. The descent rate of 1,000 ft per minute wasn't fast enough to maintain or regain the proper glide path, causing the airplane to drift further above it. The relief first officer observing from the jump seat reminded the crew that they were supposed to maintain 180 knots until 5 m from the runway. Per the air traffic controller's earlier instruction, the pilot monitoring acknowledged this reminder, but the flight crew still hadn't reduced the airspeed to 180 knots at this point. The airplane was flying too fast, making it harder for the crew to manage both altitude and speed effectively at 11:24. Approximately 8.5 nautical miles from the runway, the pilot flying called for the landing gear to be extended. Lowering the landing gear increased drag, which helped reduce the airplane's speed, but despite the additional drag, the descent rate was still insufficient to regain the desired glide path. The pilot flying could have also commanded flaps 20 to increase drag further, but he did not. The airplane remained about 900 ft above the desired glide path, and the workload was beginning to grow for the flight crew as they struggled to manage airspeed and altitude. The pilot monitoring noticed the airplane was positioned higher than it should be. Relative to the glide path, this seems a little high. The pilot flying agreed but didn't take any immediate action. A few seconds later, he asked for clarification. "Do you mean it's too high?" The first officer gave an unclear response and determined. To fix the situation, the pilot flying took action. "I'll descend more." The vertical speed was set to -1, 500 ft per minute, hoping to bring the airplane back on track for the next 21 seconds. There was no communication between the flight crew as the airplane descended through 2,600 ft at a descent rate of 1,500 ft per minute. But even with this adjustment, the aircraft was still too high. Then suddenly the vertical speed was adjusted back to -1, 0 ft per minute. This adjustment was inappropriate because the airplane was still significantly above the desired glide path. The aircraft needed to descend at a rate higher than 1,000 ft per minute to regain the correct descent path. The flight crew's failure to maintain the higher descent rate indicated a lack of situational awareness regarding their vertical position relative to the glide path. At 11:25, the controller instructed the flight crew to contact the San Francisco air traffic control tower, and the pilot monitoring acknowledged the instructions shortly after. The pilot flying confirmed that the missed approach altitude was set to 3, or 000 ft, which would be used in the event of a go-around. Moments later, the airplane crossed the last waypoint, descending through 2,250 ft duet, located about 5.4 nautical miles from the runway, had a minimum crossing altitude of 1,800 feet. However, the airplane was still approximately 450 ft higher than this. Signaling that they were still too high for the approach, the pilot flying faced the challenge of reducing speed while also descending. Being too high at this point made it much more challenging to stabilize the approach before reaching 500 ft above ground level, a critical altitude at which the aircraft must be properly aligned and stabilized for a safe landing. Flaps 20. The flaps were set to 20 as the plane descended. Through 900 ft shortly after the selected airspeed was reduced to 152 knots, and the pilot flying requested another flap adjustment. Flaps 30. Speed check flaps 30. Sir, the airplane's speed was still above 170 knots, which is the maximum allowable speed for deploying flaps. 30. As a result, the flaps couldn't be set to that position yet. Deploying flaps 30 would have helped further reduce the airplane's speed with the aircraft still flying too fast and too high. The runway was quickly approaching. The pilot flying struggled to manage the airplane's vertical profile, realizing they needed to lose altitude more quickly. He switched the autopilot pitch mode again from vertical speed to flight level change. Speed, without announcing the change as required by the Tri-7 operating manual focused on the airspeed. The pilot monitoring didn't notice the adjustment. Once the airspeed dropped below 170 knots, he immediately set the flaps to 30. When flight level change speed mode was selected, the autopilot responded by pitching the nose up to reduce the airplane speed. The selected speed was 152 knots, but the actual airspeed remained at 172 knots as the autopilot increased the pitch. The airspeed began to drop. At the same time, the selected altitude of 3 equals 0 ft set. As the missed approach, altitude was higher than the airplane's current altitude of about 1,550 ft. In response, the auto throttle advanced the thrust levers to initiate a climb, creating a conflict, reducing speed by pitching up while adding thrust to climb. The pilot flying took immediate action, realizing this wasn't the intended outcome. He disconnected the autopilot by double-clicking the wheel switch, which prevented the aural alarm from sounding. Taking manual control, he pulled the thrust levers back to idle and pushed the control column forward to stop the climb. By manually pulling the thrust levers back to idle, he unknowingly switched the auto throttle to hold mode, which meant the auto throttle was no longer adjusting. The thrust to maintain the selected airspeed with the engines now at idle. The airplane speed began to decrease rapidly. Unfortunately, the crew didn't realize that the auto throttle was disengaged, allowing the speed to drop unchecked speed target. Speed 137 at 11:26. The airplane was approximately 2.9 mm from the runway when the pilot flying adjusted the selected airspeed to 137 knots. At the time, the airplane's actual airspeed was still around 165 knots with a descent rate of about 1,000 ft per minute. By now, the crew should have been able to see the POI lights, which would have shown 4 white lights signaling that the airplane was significantly above the correct glide path. Flight director off. Okay. Asiana Airlines had an informal practice of turning off the pilot flying's flight director during visual approaches while leaving the pilot monitorings on the correct procedure, however required turning off both flight directors before reactivating the pilot monitorings. In this case only, the pilot flyings was deactivated if both had been switched off. The auto throttle would have switched back to SPD mode, resuming automatic airspeed control. This missed step may have helped prevent the rapid speed loss that followed. As the airplane descended through 1,000 ft at an airspeed of 151 knots, the POI lights showed 4 whites signaling the aircraft was still too high. Despite this, the airplane speed was dangerously low, and the descent rate was now much faster than needed after staying above the glide path. Throughout the descent, the aircraft suddenly began to drop rapidly, further compounding the unstable approach. Minimums. The crew's attention appeared divided, and the pilot flying's focus shifted between trying to maintain the glide path and controlling the airspeed. Since the approach was not stabilized at 500 ft above ground level, a critical decision height for most approaches, the flight crew should have initiated a go-around. However, the pilots did not notice that the parameters exceeded the stabilized approach criteria, or assumed the deviations were minor and could be corrected in time. The airplane's airspeed began to drop below the reference speed of 132 knots, and the POI lights indicated the aircraft was dropping below the glide path with 1 white light and 3 red lights visible. The pilot, monitoring and relief first officer observed the low airspeed, but there was no immediate corrective action. The pilot flying increased the airplane's pitch to about 40 degrees nose up, but this was not enough to arrest the descent or recover the proper airspeed 200 as the airplane descended through 200 ft. The air speed had fallen to 122 knots, and the POI lights showed 4 red lights indicating the aircraft was now significantly below the glide path. The airplane was rapidly losing altitude, and the airspeed continued to drop. Reaching 114 knots, the pilot monitoring called out its low, as the glide path and airspeed were now critically mismanaged. At this point, the pilot flying had difficulty seeing the POI lights. Despite these warnings and visual cues, the flight crew did not initiate a go-around. This critical decision would have allowed them to abort the landing attempt and circle back for another approach, but it was already too late to recover. The airplane speed had fallen to 103 knots, and the stick shaker, a warning device that activates when the aircraft approaches a stall, began to vibrate. The control column, the pilot monitoring, advanced the thrust levels, attempting to add go-around thrust. The engines responded, but the airplane's altitude was now just 39 ft above. The ground and the airspeed was too low to avoid impact. The pilot, flying, pulled back on the control column, trying to initiate a climb, but with the aircraft flying so low, avoiding disaster was no longer possible. At 11:27, the tail of Asiana Airlines Flight 214 struck the seawall at the edge of the runway. The impact sheared off the tail section, ejecting several people from the aircraft. The airplane then spun around with the main fuselage skidding along the runway before coming to a stop. In the grass, emergency slides were deployed and passengers rushed to evacuate the airplane. Amid the chaos, the crash was caused primarily by the flight crew's mismanagement of the airplane's speed and altitude. During the final approach, the crew failed to monitor key flight parameters including airspeed and vertical profile, resulting in an unstable approach despite multiple warning signs and visual cues. The pilots did not initiate a go-around. As a result, the airplane struck the seawall wall just before the runway leading to the crash. Miraculously, 304 of the 307 people on board survived the crash, though many suffered serious injuries. 3 passengers tragically lost their lives. The investigation highlighted the crew's lack of experience performing visual approaches without the aid of the ILS glide slope, the captain's limited experience flying the Boeing Tri-7, and the breakdown in communication between the crew significantly contributed to the accident after the crash, as several safety recommendations were made, including improvements in pilot training on manual flying skills and approaches without ILS support. The accident served as a reminder of the critical importance of situational awareness communication and proper use of automation